We engage in dialogue with all interested parties. This tour was planned quite some time ago. In Algeria, we had very substantive and extended talks with President Tebboune and Foreign Minister Lamamra. We have good ties in defence and industrial sectors, and an active cultural and humanitarian exchange. We also value the resistance of the Arab nations to the Western lead and their impartial assessment of the situation in Ukraine. They don't join the sanctions regime against Russia because they generally understand that the cause of the current events is the blatant refusal of our Western colleagues to agree on equal and impartial security in our common region. My Oman visit was the first one since Sultan Haytham bin Tariq Al Said acceded to the throne. He gave me a warm welcome and spent a lot of time with me. I really appreciated this from His Majesty, as the Oman Protocol doesn't require interaction with ministerial-level officials in such format. The talks have demonstrated that we have a lot of potential for development, especially in trade and economy. We are able to take these ties to the level of our political dialogue. We have a lot of opportunities, for example in energy and IT. Then, on June the 1st, I will take part in the regular session of the Foreign Ministers Forum of Gulf Cooperation Council, Russia, in Riyadh. This is a format that has been around for quite some time. Due to COVID-19, there was a pause in our meetings. Now, our friends have suggested we resume the practice. In addition to the GCC Russia Forum, we will also have bilateral meetings with almost all members of the organization. All Arab nations have adopted an attitude of responsibility. They have proven that they always act in a way that best serves their national interests, and that they wouldn't sacrifice these interests for the sake of someone else's geopolitical schemes. Overall, our relations are based on mutual respect. We respect the fundamental interests of the Arab countries, and we take their security concerns seriously. They, in turn, recognize threats to Russia's security, the threats that the collective West has been engineering for decades, right on our borders, trying to use Ukraine to contain Russia and inflict serious damage on our country.
Do you believe they are ready to continue with that policy despite the Western pressure, the Anglo-Saxon alliance, as we call it?
Yes, the Anglo-Saxon alliance has infinite gall, and they show it daily. The West doesn't honour its obligations under the UN Charter to respect the sovereign equality of states and abstain from interfering in their internal affairs. Instead, it keeps sending its ambassadors and emissaries to Arab nations and every other capital of the world to bluntly blackmail and deliver ultimatums. It also uses certain situations in its blackmailing efforts and directly threatens other parties with punishment, saying they will regret not joining the sanctions against Russia. This is outright disrespect of sovereign nations. But by the reaction of the Arab nations and most other states in Asia, Africa and Latin America, we see that they don't want to sacrifice their national pride and be lackeys to their senior partners. It only shows that the colonial state of mind and habits of our Western colleagues have never changed. The US and Europe are still thinking along those lines, each in their own historical style. They think they can impose their will on others. This isn't right, and it's deplorable. It goes against the historical process of forming a multipolar world with several centres of economic growth, financial power and political influence. There's no doubt that India and China are the world's most fast-growing economies with a lot of influence, just like Brazil and other Latin American countries. The colonialists repress the potential of Africa that lies in its immense amount of natural resources. They are still repressing it in the neo-colonial age that hasn't ended yet, so Africa is raising its voice too. I am positive that the Arab Middle East is one of the pillars of the emerging multipolar world.
Russia, China, India and other nations have friendly relations. Could we see an alliance of those nations to oppose the US bloc?
We never founded alliances or buddied up against anybody. We have an extensive and well-established network of partner organizations. These are the structures created after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and the Eurasian Economic Union. There are also organizations that bring together players across a greater geopolitical landscape, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that has currently established and is developing closer ties with the EAEU, and the coupling of the Eurasian integration projects with the Chinese initiatives, like the Belt and Road Initiative. The People's Republic of China and the EAEU have signed a corresponding agreement. The coupling of integration processes include more and more territories. Aside from the EAEU and the SCO, these organizations have also signed memorandums of mutual understanding with ASEAN. And this is the so-called Greater Eurasia Project, the Eurasian Partnership that will connect the whole continent. President Putin spoke about it at the Russia-ASEAN Summit 6 years ago, and this project is taking shape based on real processes on the ground. It has a purely Eurasian aspect to it. Many Arab nations are interested in collaborating with the SCO, where all of the other leading sub-regions of our great continent are represented. Substantive, positive alliances that don't seek rivalry with anybody are becoming a global trend. The membership of BRICS proves it: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Our Saudi friends in Argentina expressed similar interest in this organization. The foreign minister of Argentina has declared the nation's intent to become a full member of BRICS. The preparation for its next summit is underway, which will feature an outreach format. A dozen countries, developing mostly, will participate in it. So the progress is there. And we know our Western friends have many phobias and complexes, a superiority and infallibility complex, for example. But they are also paranoid because they see opposition and a threat to their dominance in any process they don't control or are not part of. It's time to get rid of such habits.
Would you say the recent Russia-China joint military exercises are indicative of something?
This is an extension of our partnership, which aims to strengthen security in the region. Russia and China hold regular military drills and various other exercises together. The goal is to enhance our anti-terrorism coordination and strengthen our common borders as members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Russia and China have a long history of fruitful cooperation in the area of defense. For years now, we've held regular exercises in the areas where we share borders, where our security interests overlap. This reflects the responsibility and commitment of both Russia and China to matters of security.
The Anglo-Saxon alliance has shown zero concern about the problem of biological weapons, despite all the evidence revealed by Russia. How can we make the world recognize the dangers of biological warfare? Although, if you read the press, especially in the Russian-speaking world, they talk about a historic moment, now that Russia has exposed those labs to the world.
This is in direct violation of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Under this convention, for years we have advocated the creation of a transparent and universal verification mechanism. In these efforts, we've been supported by all other countries except the United States. The proposed mechanism would allow all countries to verify that none of the parties to the convention are in violation of their obligations. Since 2001, for more than 20 years, the US has vehemently opposed this initiative. We know today why they have adopted this position, because all these years they have been creating military biological laboratories around the world. There is an entire division of the Pentagon, the Defense Threats Reduction Agency, in charge of these operations. In developing their network of military and biological laboratories, the Pentagon has directed special attention to the former Soviet Union countries and Eurasia in general. If you look at the available data on where such laboratories have been set up, you can see they've been established primarily along the border of the Russian Federation and in close proximity to the People's Republic of China. Initially, we expected that the experiments conducted in these laboratories are not exactly peaceful or innocent in nature. Then the Russian armed forces, along with the Donetsk and Lugansk militias, discovered these laboratories in Mariupol, the city liberated as part of the special military operation. The Americans, who abandoned these laboratories in haste before the arrival of the troops, attempted to destroy all the documents and samples, but they couldn't wipe out all evidence. The pathogen samples that survived, as well as documents found, clearly demonstrate that the purpose of those experiments was a military one. From these same documents, it became clear that there are dozens of similar labs across Ukraine. So we will work to ensure that, first of all, the evidence we have presented to the UN Security Council is taken very seriously. As you've pointed out, the overwhelming majority of developing countries do take it seriously. And secondly, that this information lays the groundwork for concrete actions to be taken under the Biological Weapons Convention. The United States must clarify what exactly they were up to, and we will also investigate further reports that certain other countries, namely the UK and Germany, were involved in these experiments, specifically those conducted in the Ukrainian labs.
If it's not classified, where else did you find laboratories like these, close to Russia?
No, it's not. There are similar labs in Armenia, Kazakhstan, and in several Central Asian countries. We are working with these countries through bilateral channels and as members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization to address these issues. With virtually every CSTO country and other members of the CIS, we have signed or are in the process of signing memorandums on biological security. Under these memorandums, countries agree to inform each other of their respective biological research programs. Naturally, this requires transparency, so we can make sure none of these programs have a military dimension to them. That's forbidden by the Convention. Also, these memorandums allow the sides to visit each other's research facilities and examine the activities of their biolabs. In addition, it's stated in the documents that there must be no military representatives of any third party at any of our biological facilities.
In what way would these countries benefit from hosting biolabs like these? Some material gain, maybe?
Firstly, the Soviet Union had a massive biological research program. When the USSR signed the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, the program was stripped of all its military components, but the research itself was still valuable from a scientific standpoint. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, we all remember what state our country was in. The very integrity of Russia was at stake. We had no reserves to pay off our national debt. Our people didn't have the money to purchase even the basic everyday necessities. Our Western partners quickly seized the moment, as they say. They offered their services in all aspects of life, penetrated all areas of the newly independent countries. They sent their advisors, their consultants, and now we're reaping the results. But times have changed. These are no longer young and inexperienced, freshly independent republics that have just woken up from the Soviet dream. This is all in the past now. All the former Soviet republics have grown stronger, established themselves as completely sovereign and independent states. They can now decide for themselves which partners to choose in the international arena. We have agreements with them, saying that the commitments they made back then, as part of the CIS, the CSTO, and the Eurasian Economic Union, that these commitments must be duly respected by other countries that are interested in fostering relations with all the states of the former Soviet Union. And, of course, we engaged in discussions about the problems we all faced back then, during the formation of our new statehood. Through various agencies, we continue to exchange information about the risks associated with such seamless collaboration with foreign countries in sensitive areas. In addition, naturally, biological research is one of those areas. As I said, we now have an understanding that we share our biosecurity issues that directly affect public health and the environment are within the jurisdiction of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So we will continue to work in a constructive manner in accordance with all these statutory documents.
Now, Turkey and Italy are proposing some sort of a plan to bring Russia and Kiev back to the negotiation table. There's even a name for it already, their own plan. Is Russia willing to engage in the negotiations that, so far, failed to produce any results?
We've talked about it many times before. Our Western colleagues simply decided to use Zelensky and use all citizens of Ukraine to the very last person to try and contain Russia. They want to cause as much damage to Russia as possible, to try and defeat Russia on the battlefield. And they're talking openly about this, in Washington, in Berlin, in London, especially in London, and in Warsaw, of course. In Warsaw, they went so far as to propose to wipe out the entire Russian world, comparing it to a cancerous tumour on the body of mankind. For years, Russia has tried to make people listen. We've tried to explain so many times why NATO's expansion eastwards and Ukraine being pulled into NATO are unacceptable. They heard us, but they didn't listen. All they had to do was make Ukraine comply with its commitments. They failed to do that in 2014, when there was a coup d'etat in Ukraine, despite the guarantees of the EU. For years, we've been calling on Kiev to fulfill its obligations. At one point, the Zelensky government publicly stated that they would never talk to these people, meaning the Donbass authorities, and the West still covered for them. Even though they were required to talk to these people by the UN Security Council resolution that approved the Minsk agreements. Then they said they would never carry out the Minsk agreements, that they would rather die than grant these republics any special status. Meanwhile, Ukraine passed a series of laws banning the Russian language in education and in the media. The use of the Russian language was prohibited, even in everyday situations. Only the Ukrainian language was recognized as the language of everyday communication for Ukrainians. Let's not forget what Zelensky said about that. If anyone feels Russian, then they should feel free to go back to Russia. He said that in September 2021. We heard all these humiliating anti-Russian racist statements, and we saw Ukraine's neo-Nazi policies, which were becoming enshrined in Ukrainian law. We tried to make the Western nations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and the relevant UN bodies take notice, but there was no reaction. Occasionally someone would say, well, yes, they have to comply with their internal obligations. But Zelensky could not care less about his government's international obligations or the constitution of Ukraine, which expressly guarantees the rights of Ukraine's Russian-speaking population. They spat on the constitution, on all the international conventions, and kept pushing through their anti-Russian laws. We've explained why we had to make a move, and our findings at the Ukrainian army's positions during the special operation suggests that it was almost too late to commence it on February the 24th. They were planning to launch a so-called Plan B on March the 8th. A large Ukrainian force that had been deployed on the line of contact by mid-February was meant to launch an assault and take over the Donbass. That would have been a severe violation of the Minsk agreements and the UN Security Council resolution. But I have no doubts that, had they succeeded, the West would have turned a blind eye to these violations, just like it has been doing so for the past 8 years. And when Kiev proposed negotiations a few days into the operation, we immediately agreed. Several rounds were held in person in Belarus. We were trying to understand the position of our Ukrainian colleagues, what they were trying to achieve, so we made our position clear. After a few rounds, in Belarus and online, we scheduled a meeting in Istanbul. During that meeting, the Ukrainian side finally provided its proposals in writing for the first time. The document was signed by the head of their delegation. We studied their proposals, reporting it to the president, and confirmed to our Ukrainian colleagues that we were ready to have them as a starting point. And since those were just disjointed elements and not a proper draft, we've prepared one on its basis. And I can't stress this enough. That draft was based on the Ukrainian proposals. Then we forwarded it to our Ukrainian colleagues, but the next day we had another gross staged provocation in Bucha. 3 peaceful days had passed after the Russian army left the city, when bodies were found in the streets, and Russia was accused of mass murder. You know what happened next. The West introduced another round of sanctions as if it knew what was going to happen, and Ukraine said it had changed its approach and wanted to reformulate the principles of the peace treaty. Nevertheless, the contacts continued. As of today, the current draft is on the Ukrainian side, and no progress has been made. But as to who's ready for talks, Zelensky was giving an interview recently. He's talking to somebody every day these days, so he was giving an interview, and he said he was ready for talks, but only between him and Putin. There is no point in talks on any other level, he thought. There shouldn't be any mediators. And only after Ukraine regains control of its territory on the borders as of February the 23rd. I guess I don't have to explain that this is just silly, but nobody can deny the West benefits from this irrational stubbornness. I've said before that the West has called to inflict a military defeat on Russia, so the war has to go on. They need to arm Ukrainian nationalists, pump weapons into Ukraine, including those that can hit Russian territory. President Zelensky has publicly requested such weapons. We have strongly warned the West against providing them. It is effectively waging a proxy war against Russia, using the hands, bodies and minds of Ukrainian neo-Nazis. But long-range weapons would drastically escalate the conflict, and I sincerely hope that the few reasonable people in the West understand that. Yes, we're looking into negotiations right now, but it's already been advertised as some kind of breakthrough step. The same goes for the Italian initiative. We haven't seen anything so far. All we hear is speculations and the descriptions of this peace initiative that surface in the media. But from what we've read, if that is the real deal, then I must say it's regrettable how little the authors of this initiative understand about the subject or about the history of the problem. If what I saw was correct, then they talk about Crimea and the Donbass being parts of Ukraine as regions with broad autonomy. No serious politician who wants to actually achieve progress on the issue and not just advertise himself to his electorate would propose something like that. The Donbass could have returned to Ukraine a long time ago if the Ukrainian governments, both Poroshenko's and Zelensky's, had complied with the Minsk agreements and granted special status to these people, the people who refused to accept the coup. All they wanted was to retain the Russian language. Also, this Italian initiative you spoke about says that in addition to the reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine, if the media reported correctly, they also want to launch a new Helsinki process to ensure the security of everyone in Europe. Funny how our friends in Rome suddenly remembered the Helsinki process now, when it's too late. because the Helsinki process gave the world, as well as our region, the Euro-Atlantic region, a number of very important things. For example, the declaration signed at the highest level at the summits of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, specifically in Istanbul in 1999 and in Astana in 2010. These documents enshrine the principle of indivisibility of security. They said that security can only be equal and indivisible. These documents contained a detailed formulation. Every country has the right to choose its own alliances, but no country can choose its alliances or otherwise strengthen its security in a way that would undermine the security of any other country. And the third component of this formula, no country, no organization in the OSCE can claim to dominate security issues. Anyone who is familiar with the situation in Europe understands that the key components of this commitment are being flagrantly violated by Western countries. They believe they are reinforcing their own security by openly violating Russia's rights to its own security. They insist that only NATO can call the shots in this region and no one else. So we tried to make these noble political concepts into reality, so that they don't just remain words on paper, followed by the signatures of America's and Europe's presidents, but so that they can actually make a change in the world. So we put forward a suggestion. Let's turn this political commitment, the one I just told you about, into an actual treaty. Let's give it some legal power. Back in 2009, we proposed such a treaty to the NATO countries. They said that they would not even consider discussing it. Do you know why? This is important. They said only NATO can provide legal security guarantees. Then we say, but what about the OSCE? You all have your signatures here, don't you? They respond with, well, these are political promises, slogans, that's all. This is very telling as to how Western politicians treat their president's signatures. But that wasn't our only attempt. We tried again later. I gave you the 2009 and 2013 timeline. Then the coup happened in 2014, the Minsk agreements in 2015. All those years, we kept saying, dear colleagues, this will not end well because you are ignoring our legitimate interests. You are rudely saying no when we are just asking you to consider our legitimate concerns. And we were not talking about some regions tens of thousands of kilometers away. We were discussing the situation at the Russian border. Imagine the hypocrisy, the audacity, the colonial mentality. I am allowed to do whatever, while you will do what I tell you. And we see this everywhere, not just in their treatment of our interests. When they need to... Remember how in 1999 the United States suddenly decided that Yugoslavia was a threat to America's national security? 10,000 kilometers away from the US coast, and they just bombed it. They used the American who headed up the OSCE mission at that time, William Walker. He cried genocide after several bodies were discovered in Rachak. As it turned out later, these were not civilians, but militants. They dressed them as civilians and laid out their bodies, similar to how things were staged in Bucha near Kiev on April the 23rd this year. The same technique. And it works even when it's not too convincing. They don't need to convince anyone. They bombed Yugoslavia. They recognized Kosovo's independence, breaking all OSCE principles. And then they said, this is how it's going to be. By the way, after the referendum in Crimea, they said, no, Kosovo's self-determination is right, but Crimea's self-determination is wrong. In 2003, the US decided that another country 10,000 kilometers away posed a threat to America.
Iraq.
They showed a vial with tooth powder, I think. Poor Colin Powell later complained that he had been set up by his intelligence agencies. And several years later, Tony Blair admitted, yes, we made a mistake, but oh well, what are you going to do? Obviously, by then there was nothing anyone could do. They bombed the country, millions of civilians were killed. Iraq's territorial integrity is still in jeopardy, and the country is facing numerous problems. Serious ones, like terrorism, for example, which wasn't a problem before the invasion. Yes, Iraq and Libya had authoritarian governments, but no terrorists. These were not combat zones with conflicts rising all the time. Libya is another example. In 2011, Obama said that America would be leading behind Europe's back. France, the most democratic country in old Europe, with its liberté, égalité, fraternité principle, headed up the NATO operation against the regime and ended up destroying the whole country. And Libya is having a really hard time getting back to normal. The French, of course, are now trying to help. They keep coming up with various initiatives, hold conferences, announce election dates, but nothing is working. They should have thought about Libya's future after the West's interference, for the sake of the country's security. I am not referring to this to say that if they are allowed to do it, why aren't we? This would be a simplification of a very complex issue. I'm just giving you examples of how the West thinks and operates. They consider the whole world their security zone. Therefore, they should decide for the whole world. Look at NATO. When NATO crawled to our borders, they responded to all our concerns by saying, "Don't worry, NATO is a defensive alliance. It doesn't threaten your security." Firstly, this is diplomatic insolence. We should be the ones to decide what is in the interest of our security, just like any other country. Secondly, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was a defense alliance when it had someone to defend itself from. When the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union disappeared, the defense line disappeared as well. Any military academy graduate will tell you that. But they maintain their military substance and continue to move the defense line, bringing it to our border. We've just covered in detail the results of this policy. In recent months, NATO's Secretary-General and other hawks, like the UK Foreign Minister, have declared that NATO should take on global obligations. NATO must ensure security in the Pacific region. I guess it means that next time NATO's line of defence will move to the South China Sea. And it's not just NATO. EU leaders also decided to play war. Ursula von der Leyen can now compete with the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, in her hawkishness. She also mentioned that the EU should take responsibility for security in the Indo-Pacific. How are they going to do it? They are talking about some EU army, but NATO will not let them have this army while the alliance exists, and it sounds like the alliance will not even be reformed. On the contrary, it wants to turn into an alliance with global dominance ambitions. This is a very dangerous path, and this plan will inevitably fail.
Thank you very much. One important question left. Our viewers want to know about Syria. How is this situation going to affect Russia's military presence there?
Our presence was requested by the legitimate president of the Syrian Arab Republic, the legitimate government of that country, and is completely in line with the principles of the UN Charter. We are addressing the tasks set out by the Security Council in Resolution 2254. We will continue to do so. And we will support the Syrian leadership in its efforts to fully restore the territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, because there are still military units of states that were never invited there. And the US military, for example, which has occupied a large part of the eastern bank of the Euphrates, is openly creating quasi-states, directly encouraging separatism and exploiting the sentiments of a part of the Kurdish population in Iraq to that end. Problems arise between the various entities that represent the Iraqi and Syrian Kurds. Naturally, all of this contributes to tensions in this part of the region. Turkey is understandably getting involved as well. We want to solve these problems exclusively on the basis of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. We speak with the Kurds. We have channels of communication with all of them, and we encourage them to look more closely at recent examples of how the United States promises things and how they keep those promises.